Hello, guys. You're welcome to the Azure Study Series 2022. So this is the second series. This is the second session we'll be having in the series. We started with last week on Azure Core Services. That was the first series. If you missed that, I'll be sharing the link to that video in the chat section. So today's topic will be talking about Azure networking. And with me here, I have Sir Kofi. Hello, Sir Kofi.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Sir Kofi. You're welcome. So good to have you on board.
And you too, likewise.
Okay, so for those of us who do not know a lot about Sir Kofi is a Microsoft MVP, so a Microsoft valuable professional. He's passionate about technology and innovation with a constant drive to learn more. He has over 10 years of experience working in the cybersecurity industry. He's a regular host of Azure Administration Series, teaching cloud technologies and services to members of Azure Certification Study Group alongside Sir David. So it's so good to have you on board, Sir Kofi.
I'm really happy to be here, Isa.
Okay. Okay,
I
thank you so
know
much.
today's a weekend. Everyone wanted to just probably go out and have fun, but
Yeah.
they decided to join into this session. So everyone, welcome to this session. I'll try my best to make it nice and very informative as possible. So,
Thank you so much.
all right.
So what do you have in store for us?
All right, so I'm just going to share my screen. Let me just bring this up.
Okay.
Right. So we're going to look into Azure networking and some fundamental security as well. All right. So to begin, let me just start the whole program. Right. So the first thing we need to consider is what is networking. When we say networking, everyone uses networking in their home environment or even at work. But then when you migrate your service to the cloud, is a network on the cloud any different from the network you have on your on-prem environment at all? In some ways, there are some similarities, and other ways they are not. All right. So the definition of network, obviously, it, network essentially allow the communication between multiple computer systems. So what about the cloud? When you move to the cloud, how do the computers or your computer resource communicate? The same thing, networking. All their resources on their cloud also will have some form of communication using the networking, even the ones that you don't have access to. For example, let's say the storage and other platform as a services. All of them will rely on the network for the communication, right? But how do these network communicate? Then you come down to an IP address. An IP address essentially is required for every device on the network to allow this communication to happen, because each device needs to be identified for this to happen. We can actually look into this in a context of, let's say, mail. When you want to send an email out, sorry, not an email, when you want to sell a mail out, the physical mail out, you first of all have to obviously post it. So, but before you do so, you need an address on the email, on the envelope, on the envelope essentially. So the address essentially is more like the IP address in a network context. All right. So once you put the address on, then you post it. Then it will get to your destination with no problems. Sometimes there might be some issues. Obviously, the same thing applies to network. There might be packet lost. It might get lost. The post might get lost. The same thing. An email might get lost, but you might have certain contingency plans in place to ensure that there is um, a high chance that obviously get to the location. The same principle can also be used in the network terms when you come to Azure. So the reason I'm bringing up this is all about understanding that when you talk about network on Azure and also network on on-prem, literally there is I mean, if you know networking on on-prem, you can shift that knowledge to networking on Azure as well. So now let's look at networking service on Azure. One of the networking service Azure provides is the Azure Virtual Network. Vnet for short. This allows many types of Azure resources such as virtual machines or VM to communicate with each other, the internet, and also on your prem network. So I have a simple demonstration here whereby you see the network communicating inside the Azure fabric from one VNet to the other, or even from one subnet to the other. And the same communication can also be passed outside to the internet when you want to probably access certain resources on the internet, and also on your on-prem environment as well. So essentially, this is the same thing that you have when you are on your on-prem environment. You have this communication going on. But the slight difference is that on your on-prem environment, you definitely have access to the physical switches or network hardware. But on your Azure, that's not the case. It's more like an abstract. You have access to the network and you can set up your own network, but you don't have access to the physical device to do so. I mean, Microsoft have a huge security in all their data centers, but there is a advantage in this as well, because essentially your resource can be deployed in multiple locations essentially. So that's one of the benefits. Obviously, if you have your resource on your on-prem or probably your data center, it's localized in that specific area. But with Azure, it's just a matter of deploying on the resource on the region that you want, essentially. So, like I said, you do not have access to those physical network. Now, let's look a bit more into the network overview. Let's have a look at a high-level overview of Azure Virtual Network. Inside the virtual network, we have a subnet. So by default, when you deploy a virtual network, a subnet is created as well to have a default subnet. So essentially, you need at least one subnet inside a virtual network. You can have multiple virtual subnet if you choose to, but you cannot have zero. They have to be one in there. And inside a subnet, you have what we call the network interface. So the network interface is the component that will connect to your, let's say, your VM. In on-prem terms, it's like your laptop having an Ethernet port, essentially. That will obviously have the physical address to allow the communications to happen. In the same context, you will need the network interface to be in a subnet so that you can get an IP address for that specific VM. And the the network interface is not just applicable to, let's say, VM. You can actually use the network interface for your public IP address as well, and also for your NHGs as well. So that's one of the things you have to bear in mind. So from what we've discussed so far, you can clearly see that there's not a lot of difference between network on the cloud and also network on your on-prem environment. Equally, you can create or use subnet for isolation and also segmentation in the cloud as well. So now let's have a quick look at some of the image or visual representation of what a virtual network might look like in a cloud. So as you can see on the screen here, when you're creating your virtual network, you have an address space which will have a huge block of addresses. So in this example, I have /16, and the subnet within this VNet will pull addresses from this address space. So you cannot have a subnet within the VNet, which have an address outside the VNet address space. It has to be within that VNet address space. And another thing is that the subnet 1 and subnet 2, or all the subnet that you have, all of them the address should not overlap. It shouldn't overlap. All of them have to have a unique address scheme, essentially, right? And then within the subnet, you have your virtual machines in there. All right. And one other thing, actually, let me move on to the next screen. All right. One other thing that you have to bear in mind is that on virtual network, the subnet within the virtual network can talk to each other, even if their address scheme are not, obviously are not, or they shouldn't overlap, so they're not the same. They can talk to each other because the underlying NHG rule, there's a default rule that are created automatically when you attach NHG rule. We will actually look into NHG in the next slide. So the NHG rule, there's a rule in there that say allow VNet to VNet communication. So that means it will allow the VNet to VNet to actually talk to each other. So the same thing applies to internet connection. It will automatically have access to the internet by default. And it will also have access to the load balancer as well if you deploy NHG. So I just want to give you a bit of definition about the network security group. So network security group is more like, it's like a firewall, but it's more like a lower version of a firewall where it only does filtering of, let's say, IP addresses and ports and protocols. Unlike your normal full-on firewall, which will actually do a bit more than that. So you can use the network security group to filter your network traffic to and from your Azure resources in Azure Virtual Network. A network security group contains security rules, as you can see here. So it allows and denies inbound network traffic to and outbound network traffic from various types of Azure resources. So for each rule, you can specify the source and the destination port and also the protocol as well. All right. So with this image, you can see here, you can actually literally have access to the internet. You can decide to deny access to the internet, and even can have access to certain resources on the Azure environment. I mean, you can access, let's say, your database, or you can access your storage account, for example. Now, talking about the fact that when you create a VNet, the traffic inside that VNet can talk to each other. One limitation is that VNet to VNet communication is not possible. You need another medium to allow that to be possible. One way is using the peering. It's not just the peering. Obviously, you can use VPN as well to allow that communication as well. With this one, we're looking at the peering. So virtual network peering enable you to seamlessly connect two or more virtual network in Azure. The virtual network appear as one for connectivity purposes. The traffic between the virtual machines in a peer virtual network use the Microsoft backbone. So when you're using a peering, the traffic is not flowing to the internet. It's actually using the Microsoft backbone, which means it's more secured. And also faster as well, because you're not really using the public internet, unlike using services like VPN that will rely on the internet for that type of communication. Another advantage is as well is that with a peering, it's not just a communication between resources or VNet in your own Azure subscription, but and also not to the same region. Essentially, it can be communication to resources on different subscription and also resources on a different region altogether. You can deploy, let's say, a VNet in, let's say, East US, and then you might probably have another resource in West US. You can use peering to allow that communication to happen as well. Like I said, it's relying on the Microsoft backbone network for the communication. And obviously, Microsoft, with all their regions they have worldwide, over 60, all of them also feed into the Microsoft network backbone. So this make it possible for them to allow the communication inter-region, which is fabulous. I mean, just think about it. If you deploy your own resource on your data center, you are extremely limited on the capability like this. All right. So now let's look at some of the securities that we can implement. Actually, before we go into those security aspects, I'm just going to share my Azure portal so you can actually look into the virtual network, how it looks essentially. So let me just bring this up. All right. So if you've not, seen our Azure portal before, it's simple. Just type in portal.azure.com. You go into the portal, and one of the beautiful things that Microsoft provides is that the creation of resources can be done in multiple ways. You can simply type in virtual network here, and then obviously you can get connected to it like that. Or you can use the menu here, and then you can click on virtual network. Or the other ways you can also do this is that if you have a specific resource that you want to deploy into, you can simply go straight to the resource. So this should load up momentarily. All right, looks like there's an issue here. Let me just go back into the resource again. Yeah, here you go. So you can simply go into a specific resource and then click on the create. And then you can equally deploy the resource you want to deploy straight into that specific resource group, which is really good. Because sometimes you just want to ensure that you make less cause less issues as possible. So selecting it this way make it easier for you to deploy straight into the resource group. Right. But what we're going to do is just going to create a whole new one. So I'm going to just click on the virtual network here, and then click on create. All right, it's just a bit slow today. Right. So when you are creating a virtual network, this is the virtual network creation blade. The first option you have is you need to select your subscription, and then followed by your resource group. So with this, I'm just going to create a brand new resource group. So I'll just name this one as test series. I'll just name it series resource group. Then you have to give it a name. So this would be the name for the virtual network. So you have to make the name a bit meaningful to whatever you're creating. So if you are creating something for your company, you need to think about it like, okay, the name have to make sense that when someone pick up these resources in my absence, it will be meaningful to them. You can use other things like tagging to also create some meaningful to the name scheme you add here. So for this one, since it's just a test, I'll just name it test Vnet. And then you select the region you want this to be in. So there are multiple regions you can deploy this into. The key is that you can deploy it to a region that is close to you or close to, let's say, if it's a resource you're deploying for your customers, wherever your customers are located, you can deploy the resource to that location to allow see that with any kind of like network communication, it's a round trip. The shorter the distance, the higher they can actually access the resource with less issues. So you define the region, and then with the next page, this is where you define the network block of address. So in a network address, by default, Microsoft will give you an address, but you can change it. You can change it. Just hover the mouse on it and then change it to the address scheme that actually fit into the resource or your organization criteria. Then you can just do that. All right. So as you can see that below the subnet, there's one created already, the subnet, which is default. the name have implications. It means no matter what, they have to be one in there. So by default, they will give you one subnet. I mean, you can decide to change the name or change the address. Obviously, this address relies on the address here. So, but you can change the name. If I click on the default, I'll get this one open up, and then I can change the name to, let's say, subnet 1. You can easily do that. All right. And with address too, you can change the address if you want to. And one thing I wanted to point out is this. With creation of your address, you need to bear in mind that 5 IP addresses are reserved. So if you're creating a resource and you need 100 IP addresses, you have to take that into consideration that 5 of those IP addresses are going to be reserved for certain purposes. I'm just going to show you momentarily. So let's go here. This is it right here. There are are there any restriction on using an IP address within these subnet? Yes, 5 are reserved, and for these purposes, just like your on-prem network, you will need a network address .0. So, like your on-prem network, the .0 will be reserved for network address, and on Azure, they also reserve the .1 for default gateway. And for .3 and also .2 and 3, that will be reserved for the DNS for the subnet space. And just like on your on-prem, you will have a broadcast address, which is always the last IP address 255. So similarly, that last address will be reserved for broadcast purposes. All right. Whilst you are here, let's just look into some of the things that you should be aware of. Right. So one key aspect would be creating of address. Just like on your on-prem, you rely on the RFC 1918, whereby these addresses are reserved for on-prem environment. So that these addresses, once you are creating, you have to obey or follow the right process and create those addresses based on what is normally generally used for private addresses. So with class A is the 10.0.0, which is the /8 prefix, and class C, class B, and also class C, these addresses, right? Okay, so let's go back to the subnet. So create a subnet, you can give it a name here, and also you can add your own NAT gateway as well, and also endpoint, service endpoint. Right. Well, another thing as well will be with what are the limitation? How many, let's say, subnet can you create? I think I have this one here which talks about that. So with Azure, in terms of the network, there's a limit of 1,000, and subnet per virtual network is about 3,000, which is a lot. So you can see that you can actually do a lot when it comes to creation of these resources. I know probably some big companies might see this limit. If they do exceed that limit, then what you have to do is you need to reach out to Microsoft support, and they can do something about that for you. All right, so now let's go back here. So I'm just going to follow through with this one and create the resource. So I'll just create the subnet 1. I'm not going to change the address scheme. I'll just stick to what we have here, and then I'll just save that. And let's move on to the next. So with the next, you can initiate security whilst you're creating this network. So what I mean by that is you can use a Bastion host, which will allow you to have that connectivity to your resources, not utilizing, let's say, RDP or SSH, because I mean, there can be some security issues with those ones, right? And also you can implement DDoS protection to protect your resource from DDoS attack. And you can also enable firewall to ensure that firewall will deploy by default for protecting your network, or for NATing of your traffic as well. All right. I'm not going to select anything from here, so I'll just go to next. With tag, creating any resources is quite important that you create tag, not just for the cost aspect of things, of knowing what the consumption of resources are on your network, but it's really essential because once you create it, at least it will give you some form of identification so that you know why the resource was created, who created the resource, which organization, which department, all those sort of things. So it's easier for you to have that governance application when it comes to it. All right. So we'll leave that one blank and then let's go to create. Creating a resource doesn't really take that long. It will take a few minutes to actually, validation is done. So creation will take probably about a minute to complete, or even less than a minute. To complete. And creating of virtual is done already. So let's go to the resource. For virtual network, there's no cost that is attributed to it, but the resource you deploy into it will cost you money, of course, because you will deploy VMs, and VMs, depending on, for each VM type you select, cost is involved, or for any other resource you might deploy in there will also have some cost association as well. Right. So once we deploy it, let's look at some of the things you can see. First of all, let's look at the topology. All right. All right, let's look at topology. It should load up momentarily. It's not loading up. It's going to move away and then move back to it and see if it'll come up. All right, it's taking a bit of time. Oh, here you go. So what we've created so far is just the network and the subnet, one subnet in there. So
Hello,
hello,
Sir
Sir
Kofi.
Kofi. Yeah, hello. Can you
So
hear me?
so sorry to interrupt you there.
there.
So we are
So
getting
we are
a
getting the
feedback that
feedback
the
that the
video is
video
not
is not
clear. Could
clear.
you
Could you
please
please
zoom
zoom
in?
in? Okay, yeah, sure. So if the video is not clear on your screen, one other thing you can actually do is that make sure on YouTube you change the resolution to, let's say, 720p, so that it will have a nicer resolution from your side. I'm just going to zoom in here as well. All right, can you see that?
Okay.
Okay,
Please,
Dr.
Doctor Olabi,
Olabi,
kindly
kindly
indicate
indicate
if it
if
is
it
now
is now
clearer,
clearer,
please.
please. Yeah. Is it better? Right, moving on. Now let's look at the address space we created. So when I click on this, that should show us the address space we created during the session. So here we go. Right. So yeah, so we show the same block of IP addresses or range for the VNet. The connected devices area will also show you when you deploy resources in here. So once we deploy, let's say, resources in here, you will see it here, and the subnet as well. You see the subnet. We can click on that one, and if we have, let's say, a network security group, we can associate a network security group to it if you want to. But we will look into network security group next. All right, so I'm just going to click out of that one. And you have the other security settings as well. You can obviously define the firewall. And another thing is the DNS. With DNS, by default, it will utilize Azure provided DNS. But if you have your own custom DNS and you want to use it for this specific VNet, you can easily define those addresses in here. And then that virtual network will utilize your own DNS, because certain times you want to utilize those services. So the option is there if you want to take that approach. So now let's look into NSG, Network Security Group. So with NSG, like I mentioned earlier, it allows you to create those rules that will be applicable to your virtual network. I mean, you attach it to your subnet, and also you can also attach it to your VMs as well, and that will manage the flow of traffic, block which one things you don't want to get into your network, or the things you don't want it to get into your virtual machine. And in terms of the application, you can apply it at the subnet level, and also apply it at the VM level as well. So whichever way you want to apply it, or if you want to apply both, then you can obviously do it, because there'll be certain scenarios whereby you want to generally allow certain services to the overall subnet, but maybe specific devices or VMs on your network, you don't want that. So then you use that NSG at the VM level to block those services. All right, let's go into the creation of a VNet real quick. I'm just a bit mindful of time here, so let me just do this real quick. All right, so with creation of a network security group, just like we did with the VNet, just a simple of selecting the resource group. So I'll use the same resource group we used before, and then you create your NSG rule. So I'll just name this one as NSG, test series NSG. And then it's extremely simple. The next option is just to review and then create. Right. So once this is created, we can actually link this one to our subnet. So the resource is created already. If I navigate back into the NSG rule we just created, as you can see, by default, without doing anything, these rules are created. It comes with it. And there's no option to remove it. So these are the system-defined rules. I can create my own, and with that one, I have the ability to remove them and delete them. But the one created by the system, I can create one on top of it, and one way that the way it works is that it works from it use priority basis. So the lower the priority, the higher or the likelihood that it will hit that rule. So you actually have to keep that in mind when you're creating a rule. The lower the number, that means that will go at the very top. So if I, for example, I want to create an inbound rule for, let's say, RDP, for example. So I'll click on the inbound security rule here, because I want the traffic to come into my network, and then I can click on add. The source will be any, because the source will be where my the connection is coming from. So if it's coming from on the internet and I don't have the IP address, I want anyone to connect to it, then I can leave it at any. But in the real world, you have to be mindful of that. And in terms of the source port, I will leave that one as any. And in terms of the destination, that's where I want my traffic to get to, which in this case would be the RDP. So I can change the customer service here, and then I can select the RDP. I think there is one already created. Yeah, there you go, RDP. If the service is not defined here, then I can type in the number here as well, and that will do the same trick. All right, so in this scenario, I'm just going to allow it, and I will set a priority to something lower than what we have here. So in this case, I'll set this one to 100, and the name, I'll make it more meaningful. So I probably can make it, 339, or you can make it RDP, wherever floats your boat. All right, so once we've done that, you can give a bit of a description as well, which is good, so you know what the rule is all about, and then you can add it. It will take a moment or two to complete. Once it's done, it should be located at the very top. Obviously, considering the fact that the number is less than any of the ones we have here. Right. So I'm just going to move away momentarily and move back in there. And as you can see, It shows the rule there. You see that there's a triangle icon there indicating that, I mean, there are better ways to connect your computers inside your network, and this is considered to be a bit unsafe. Right. So once that is created, we can now attach this one to, let's say, the subnet we just created, and we can do it straight from here. So as you can see from here, there's a subnet object here. I can click on that, and then once it loads up, I can then select the network, and then so I'll click on associate, and then I can select the network I want to associate this to. So in this scenario, we're looking for test series. So test series, we have sorry, the test series network. So where is it? Yeah, test series. Yeah, there you go. So you select that one, and now we can see subnet 1 in there. So we can select subnet 1, and then we can just click OK. All right, so now it should link that to subnet 1. So if we navigate back to, let's say, the network and go to test Vnet, and we go into, actually, if we go into, let's say, the topology, let's see what I think it should show us the, all right, it's taking time to load up. So the reason why I check the topology is that it will give you a visual representation of what exactly you've created. It will actually show you the connections. So we show you that you're in the VNet, and then the VNet will have, let's say, NSG, and the NSG is associated to a subnet, essentially. All right, this is taking a bit of time to load up. So let's move on. Let's go back to our slides. Right. So going back to our slides, we have the VNet pairing. So with VNet pairing, it allowed the communication from VNet to VNet. So if you have multiple VNet, automatically they can talk to each other. And the only way they can talk is when you use something like VNet pairing or VPN for that matter, to allow the communication to happen. Right. So as like I explained before, with a VNet pairing, it can also allow communication from a VNet in one region to the other, or a VNet in one subscription to the other. All right. Let's look at service endpoint. With service endpoint, just consider this: with your virtual network service endpoint, it provides a secure and direct connectivity to your Azure service over an optimal route, which is what? The Microsoft backbone. So it provides that level of security, because sometimes what you might want to do is that you don't want to essentially allow anyone to connect to your resource. So you want to probably block public access. So blocking that, you will need to use another medium or another service to allow the internal resources on your VNet to talk. This is where that's where service endpoint come in, right? It allows those private IP addresses on your VNet to be able to talk to your resources like SQL, even Azure Vault as well, or Azure Key Vault, or your storage as well, to allow that to happen. So you're no longer allowing, let's say, people on the internet to connect to these resources, but you're allowing resources within your VNet to talk to the resources on Azure, which is very good. And one thing you have to also bear in mind is that this is specific sort of resources that are supported. It's not every resource. So you can actually check to see whether the resource you have is in there. But they have an extensive list of Azure services that are supported as well. Now let's move on to private link. So with service endpoint allowing you to have that connectivity to your resources and then blocking external connectivity from the internet, Azure Private Link also provide a private connectivity for your virtual network to the platform as a service, or even for your own customers' own services. For example, you can use it to, if you have your own resource on your on Azure that you want to your Vnet to have access to, you can use the private link to do that as well. All right. And also, if you are Microsoft partners, they can also take advantage of that. You can utilize that one to connect to those partner services. It simplified the network architecture and secure the connection between endpoint and Azure by eliminating the data exposure to the public internet. Another key factor that you get with private link is that it the private link create what we call the private endpoint. With a private endpoint, it will also have an IP address uh, on the subnet you deploy on your VNet. So it will act like it's actually in the same subnet, essentially. So when it's acting like the same subnet, it allows that security, that level of security, and traffic remains on the network with no public internet access. It also integrates with on-prem and peer network. So doing this will definitely have a huge level of protection, especially against exfiltration of data from or resources from your network. Right. Let's have a quick look at this on the Azure portal. So to get access to this, we can simply just type in private endpoint, private link. Yeah, once you load up momentarily, you can simply select the private endpoint here, and then you click on create. Just like any resources on Azure, you select your resource wherever you want to push this resource to, then you give it a name, then a region. All right, I'm not going to create this because of time, but I'm just going to show you in a simple way. Actually, another good thing of private endpoint is that with service endpoint, you get access to the specific resources, but it won't give you access to, let's say, it doesn't go to the subsystem resources. For example, when you want to have access to Azure storage, for example, right, you can get it based on the level of the Microsoft storage level. If you want to go a bit more, let's say you want to be more granular, get into, let's say, a block or files, you have to use the private endpoint, because the private endpoint give you that option. Right, I'm just going to show you this real quick. So if I go to the next page, this is it right here. So once you select, let's say, the resource type, let's just say storage as an example. You select your storage. Then once you select your storage, I don't have any storage here. So once you select it, but you can also target it to the specific resource you want to go into, the sub resource. So that will give you that level of granularity, right? Now let's have a quick look into service endpoint. With service endpoint, actually, let me just go to, let's say, storage. Let's pick up one of these. All right. And let's quickly go to security. So I think that will be network and firewall. So with network and firewall, we can select specific network, and then we can define the network that can access this resource. So in that case, only what we define here can have access to this storage resource. I mean, with storage, is essentially exposed to the internet. They have what publicly available FQDN, so anyone can actually connect to it. So by utilizing services like this, it will allow you to prevent that from happening. And then, if your organization just wants access to those resources but not exposing it to the internet, then you take advantage of this service. Right. Now let's move on to the next one. Azure Bastion. Right. So as early as you saw, I actually connect. I didn't really connect, but on the NSG rule, I define the RDP service to allow anyone from the internet to, if they want to connect to resources within the subnet I created. I created port 3389 so that they can connect to it. But the issue that we have with that is that you're exposing yourself, and once I think there are multiple instances whereby people have exposed themselves like that, and then probably will be a brute force attack on your resource. To prevent that, you can utilize what we call the Azure Bastion, right? So it will provide you that level of security. It's utilizing 443 for that connection. It's using the HTML5 essentially. So it will create the TLS connection from your side to your resource, and from your resource to from the Bastion service to your target VM, it will still use the port 3389, but it's not exposing yourself. Because one thing you have to bear in mind is that most of these attackers, what they do, the first thing they do is they can scan your network to see what ports are available, what ports are open. Once they identify the ports that are open, especially once they see that 3389 is open on your network, that means they can try to see how they can get into your network utilizing that. But if you're using Azure Bastion, right, they won't see port 3389 because you've blocked that one and only allow the Bastion, which means the traffic will go over the access to your resources will go over 443, and literally web services are all on 443. So they will not even know that you have that type of connection. On top of that, to access the Bastion, you actually do it through the Azure portal. So you have to literally put your username and password in the portal, and then it will connect to the resource essentially, which is extremely good. Another advantage is that it traverses all firewalls because essentially, unless they are blocking 443, then and I know most organizations probably will block 3389 if they don't see the reason to open that port. But when you're using Bastion, you can simply connect to those resources because it's utilizing 443 for that type of connection. Let me quickly show you that. All right. So here we go. Right. So I think I have some few services I can use for this demo. If I go to VM, virtual machines, and I think this VM probably might have it. Let me just click on this one here. Right. So normally when you click on your resource, you can literally copy the IP address and then use RDP service to connect to it. Or you can click on connect here. So once you click on connect, it should load up momentarily. Yeah. So once you click on connect, you can copy the RDP information and then connect it that way, or can use Bastion. Right. So when you have Bastion configured, then you have the ability to put in your username and password. This one does not have it. So let me see if I have any client on my system here that has Bastion. Let's see. Yeah, so this one has it. So with that one, all I have to do is just type in the username. So the username and password. So I think this one is Azure user password. All right. Let me just see. So here you have it. So this will simply connect to my resources using the Azure Bastion. Yeah, so this is just a demo, but yeah, so that's all you have to do to create that connection over the internet. You don't need to use open up any port on your network. You don't need that, and that will allow that to go through. So moving on, let's just move on to the next slide. So firewall. So this will be the last slide, by the way. So firewall obviously is one of the important thing you should have in your on-prem environment. The same thing applies to you in the cloud. Azure provide you what we call the firewall as a service. A stateful firewall, a full managed firewall, high availability and unrestricted scalability. So unlike the NSG, obviously with NSG you're limited in terms of let's say filtering your traffic based on FQDN. But with Azure Firewall, it gives you the ability to filter your traffic using FQDN. And on top of that, you can also use it based on IP addresses, right? So that's one of the things you have to take into consideration. But obviously, with Azure Firewall, it's really good. But if you compare that to your other normal traditional firewalls, it still doesn't have some of the features that I mean, a full-on UTM might have. But for filtering of your traffic, you can easily utilize this service for that. But when you're creating Azure Firewall on Azure portal, or even using the other medium like a CLI or the PowerShell, you need to define a specific subnet. It's quite specific. It's the same logic applies to even Azure Bastion. You need to define a subnet called Azure Firewall subnet, and that subnet will be utilized for Azure Firewall, essentially for firewall service. If you don't have it and you're trying to create it, it will tell you to obviously do that first. It will first of all check that specific VNet to see whether there's a predefined Azure, a predefined subnet with a name, specific name, Azure Firewall subnet. If it does not exist, then it's not going to obviously allow you to create. So you have to go back and create that specific subnet. One of the other advantages that Azure Firewall provide is that it provides DNAT and also SNAT. So you can obviously on your network, if you have multiple IP addresses, you might have to use SNAT to ensure that specific traffic goes through, let's say, specific public IP address utilizing the SNAT function. If you want traffic from outside to come into your resource inside the network and you want all your traffic to go through a firewall, you can also use a DNAT on the Azure Firewall to allow traffic coming originating from outside to obviously tunnel into a specific resource on your network. Another advantage that you have with Azure Firewall is the threat intelligence. So these are additional functionality to identify malicious IP addresses and domain as well. So nowadays it's crucial that you know the bad actors. I mean, if there are ways to know it beforehand and obviously warn your users or block them from your network, then it's a plus. So that's what these threat intelligence actually provide. Another thing that Azure Firewall is also notorious for is monitoring. So with most of Azure services, Azure monitoring is integrated into them. The same thing applies to Azure Firewall, utilizing the monitoring aspect of your or the monitoring on Azure essentially. So it will stream in data, utilize the log analysis and whatever you. Even you can archive the old entries. So if you want to have the historic data, you have access to those informations as well. So I mean, we are limited on time. I think I'm right on time. It's 4 minutes to go. I just wanted to end here. And if you have any questions, just fly my way, and then I'll do my best to answer them. All right. So once again, thank you for joining this session.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
so much,
Sakofe, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah,
Yeah,
so you took us through creation of Azure Visual Network. You talked about the Azure Bastion, then the subnetting. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here.
All right.
Yeah, from Matt Stream. What are the infrastructure requirements for an offline network?
Can you repeat that?
He said, what are the infrastructure requirements for an online network?
For online network. So on the cloud, or okay. So when the requirement, when you're saying the requirement, let's say for example, you are trying to deploy a VM, right? The VM, one of the requirements is that you need it to be in a network, and that network also have to rely on the subnet. So those have to be in place. So once you're creating those resources, that resource, you need to ensure that those elements are taken into consideration. For example, when you try to create a VM, let me just bring it one moment. When you try to create a VM, for example, it's a bit slow. 1 second. Yeah, when you're trying to create it, as part of the process, there is a network part, right? So with a network part, it have to be is something that you cannot do without. That's why there's an asterisk there. So it's part of the connectivity to allow you to have that service online. And once you do it, automatically that resource will have access to the public internet when it's linked to NSG. Does it answer your question? Is there any question, or that's it?
Yes, we have more questions.
All right.
Okay, so from Mike Pelario, it said, is NAT gateway and firewall the same?
Right. So with NAT Gateway, at the moment, there is obviously another service that will allow that. So they are not the same. So you literally, if I go to any of the objects, the network object, you have the ability to create NAT Gateway as well. So the NAT Gateway, what it will do is, right, it will be responsible for doing your normal NATing for DNAT and also your SNAT. So if I go to the network objects. Let me just select the test one. All right. So with the test one, as you can see here, I can define the NAT gateway here. But when we come to the firewall, what I have to do is I have to rely on root table, right? So for example, I have a firewall here. So that means I have to link it to a root table for me to have access to that. But for the NAT gateway, I can easily, if I have one, I can easily select it here. But with the firewall, it have to be this format. If I go to I have this routing table here. Currently, this one is linked to a virtual appliance, but in the same principle, when I have a firewall, I will have to then set it up in a way that I will point all the traffic on that specific network. So in this instance, I am pointing traffic from the LAN, all traffic from the LAN to this IP address. So in this instance, to this firewall, and then all the traffic will flow through that. So that will be two different types of service.
Thank you so much. We might
We
not
might
be
not
able
be
to
able to
take
take
other
other
questions,
questions,
but
but
do not
do not
worry.
worry.
Please stay
Please stay
close to the
close to the
community
community
so that
so that
you can
you can
always
always
ask your
ask your
questions,
questions. Yeah,
and there
absolutely.
is always
Always
someone there
someone
to
there to
answer your
answer your
question.
question.
Please
Please
subscribe to the
subscribe to the
YouTube
YouTube
channel
channel
and click
and
on the
click on the
notification
notification
bell so
bell
that
so
you'll be
that you'll be
notified
notified
whenever we
whenever we
upload a
upload a
new
new
video.
video.
Please
Please
follow us
follow
on
us on our
LinkedIn
LinkedIn
channel
channel
at
at
Nigeria
Nigeria
Microsoft
Microsoft
Azure
Azure
Meetup Group.
Meetup Group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
thank you
thank you
so
so
much,
much,
everyone, for
everyone, for
joining the
joining the.
session. Thank you, Sakofi.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to help you in this program. Hopefully, we might see you next week and the other weeks that we have this session. So, once again, thank you.
Thank you
And
so much,
yeah, see
everyone,
you
for
next week.
joining. Yeah. Thank you, Sakofi. All right. Have a good
All right.
day. Stay safe.
All right. See you guys. Bye for now.